Hello, welcome back, hope you're all doing well. Now today's case is my favourite kind of case, which is the truth is stranger than fiction type cases, where the more you learn about what happened, the more your jaw just drops. You can't believe what these people did and the situations they got themselves in. I've got a similar case to this, it's my Lisa Nowak case, so I'll link that up above somewhere if I can, and I'll pop it in the description below as well. And this one is probably even more shocking, so let's get into it, shall we? Today's case begins on December 1st, 2007 at 5:30 p.m. when a middle-aged man walks into the West End Central London police station. He approaches the desk and says, "I think I'm a missing person." He gives his name as John Darwin. He's from a small town in the northeast of England named Canoe, and he gives his date of birth. He has no ID on him aside from a wallet containing £140, and he has a key ring with some keys attached, although he says he doesn't know what doors those keys open. John says he's suffering from amnesia and has absolutely no memory of the last 5, almost 6 years. He doesn't know where he's been or what he's been doing that entire period of time. John is also very confused, asking the police officer why all the Christmas decorations are up, because he believes it to be the middle of summer. So this London police officer searches the database for a man named John Darwin from Canoe, and he immediately gets a match. A man named John Darwin with the same date of birth went missing almost 6 years ago in Canoe. So the officer calls the local police station and he lets them know that standing in front of him is their missing and presumed dead local man, John Darwin. So who is John Darwin? John Ronald Darwin was born on the 14th of August 1950 in Hartlepool, County Durham, to his mother Jenny, a cook at the local hospital, and his father Ronnie, a bricklayer for the local council. As a boy, John was outgoing and adventurous. His childhood was spent hanging out at the local beach, building campfires and exploring the local caves. As he got older, John was a cheeky and confident young man. He had a lot of curly hair, and due to his slim build, he had the nickname Dinky, which, if you don't know, is another word for small. I thought that was just an English thing, but apparently it is used in the US too. John, growing up, was brought up to believe that money was very important in life, which it is, but in his family it was considered an absolute priority. John's father, Ronnie, was determined to make the most of himself, and so he worked very hard at his job to be as successful as he could be. And whilst the family weren't rich, they were comfortable. Ronnie was always aiming for more in life, and he instilled that in John too, who in turn was determined to one day break away from the working class background he was born into and someday have lots of money. As a teen, John attended the St Francis Roman Catholic Grammar School, and in order to get to school he needed to take the bus, and it was during one of those many journeys that he first laid eyes on Anne Stevenson. Anne Catherine Stevenson was born 3rd of July 1952 in Hartlepool to mother Kathleen and her dad Harry. Anne was a reserved and quiet girl who attended St Joseph's Convent Grammar School, and in order to get to school she rode the same bus as John Darwin. John took an immediate shine to Anne, but it's fair to say that John was more interested in Anne than she was in him. But John intended to change that, so in order to get her attention he would tease Anne by doing things like sitting behind her on the bus and knocking her school hat off her head. Anne didn't appreciate this at all, so she just turned round and glared at him, so he really didn't get the attention that he wanted from her. John left school at 16 to attend college to study A-levels, which then led him to Teacher Training College in Manchester. 2 years younger than John, Anne was 16 and working in a sweet shop for some pocket money. And when John was home from college, he would go into the shop and buy sweets as a ploy to speak to Anne. He would make sure he only ever asked for sweets from the top shelf, knowing that Anne would have to climb a ladder to get them. Even though John would frequently ask her out, Anne, who still wasn't especially impressed by this very sure of himself, cocky young man, always said no. She just wasn't that interested in him. After graduating, John then gets a job at a local school, teaching maths, science and religious studies, and he never gives up on his desire to date Anne. He continues to ask her out for years, until eventually when Anne is 20 years old and now a secretary, she finally says yes to 22-year-old John. To Anne's surprise, the date goes quite well and they spend a lot of time together. John makes romantic gestures, which Anne appreciates, and he has a good sense of humour. John grows on Anne and eventually John proposes and the two are married at St Joseph's Catholic Church in Blackhall Colliery on the 22nd of December 1973. John's parents put forward a deposit for a house in a place called Ledgate and the two move in and start their married life together. 2 years later they move again to a place called Witton Gilbert. All of these places are in the northeast of England, by the way. And they welcome 2 children. First Mark, born on the 23rd of November 1975, and then Anthony, born on the 3rd of September 1978. After a very long spell as a teacher, John grows tired of teaching and becomes a financial advisor at Barclays Bank, but he soon realises that's not for him either, and so in another complete career change, he goes to work as a prison guard at Home House Prison in Stockton-on-Tees. And to coincide with that, the family also move house, moving in December 2000 to Seaton Carew. Seaton Carew is a coastal town in County Durham in the northeast of England. It's a pretty small place with the population of about 7,000. It's right on the coast of the North Sea, near to the local town Hartlepool and the River Tees. They move into a property named Number 3 The Cliff, a large Victorian townhouse that John is incredibly proud of. It's positioned right on the seafront. Now, this house is actually conjoined to the house next door, so in actual fact, John bought both Number 3 and Number 4 The Cliff. So a couple of years pass, and whilst this new house, or houses, was the home of his dreams, John, now aged 51, still isn't happy with his lot. He doesn't like his job much and he's in some financial difficulty. So to de-stress, he likes to go out into the sea in his red canoe. Now, I believe technically what John uses is a kayak, as it has a closed deck and a 2-bladed paddle, but in this case it's only ever referred to as a canoe, so I'll be calling it a canoe in this video. So at around 4:30 p.m. on March 21st, 2002, John takes his canoe out and starts to head out into the North Sea, as witnessed by some passers-by and a neighbour who often sees John from his window heading out to water. Now, this neighbour notices that the water's a little choppy on this particular day, but he thinks, well, John's well practised in this. If he thinks it's okay to be out in it, then it must be, and he thinks nothing else of it. Then later that evening, when Anne gets home from work, she realises immediately that John isn't there and that the prison has called her house, wondering where John is as he hasn't turned up for work. Anne spots that the canoe is missing and is worried. She doesn't know what else to do, and his car is still there, so he hasn't gone anywhere else, and in the end she calls the police and reports John as missing. A large-scale search is launched for John, including 5 RNLI lifeboats, 2 Coast Guard rescue teams, a police plane with heat-seeking equipment, an RAF helicopter, and numerous teams of police officers. The RNLI is the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, which is a charity that works to save lives at sea, in case you're wondering. The search stretches all the way from Seaton Carew to Staithes, and the operation is described as looking for a needle in 100 haystacks. 65 RNLI volunteers spend 85 hours looking for John, and eventually on the 25th of March, 4 days after John went missing, they have to stop the search because after 4 whole days out in the freezing cold North Sea, the Coast Guards have to make the difficult decision to end it because the chances of John still being alive are highly unlikely, and he had to, at this stage, be presumed dead. Anne doesn't know what to do and can't bring herself to tell her sons Mark and Anthony, and so her parents tell them. Anthony even flies back early from Niagara Falls, where he's planning to propose to his girlfriend. The weeks pass and they are, of course, all devastated and beside themselves and totally confused as to how this has happened. All they can do is to grieve John, but without a body, that's difficult to do. There's no answers and no closure for them. 6 weeks after John went missing, a walker spots John's smashed up canoe in the water at the Blue Lagoon Sands, which is a location at the mouth of the River Tees, close to where John disappeared. This person pulls it to shore and calls the police. Anne is able to identify this canoe as being John's because he'd named it Orca shortly before he disappeared, and the painted letters on the canoe were still visible on it, even though it was incredibly damaged. A lifeboat is sent out for a second time along with the RNLI, who again search for miles in every direction in search of John, but again nobody is found. Come August, the family think they might have found John when a body is washed up in the water where John disappeared, but after further examination, it isn't him. Mark and Anthony remain distraught. Not only had they lost a father, but they feel like they've lost their best friend too. A year passes, and in April 2003, John is declared missing, presumed dead. It's agreed at the inquest that because he had a known condition, that being angina, that he might have had a heart attack whilst out at sea, or that he might have just gotten into trouble whilst out and drowned. And that was it. To his family's despair, John was officially dead, and they were left to grieve him for the next 5.5 years, never truly knowing what happened. So October 2007 rolls around and Anne decides she needs a fresh start. She's a widow now, so she owns the house she shared with John, and that house is full of memories, and she just wants to get away. She tells Mark and Anthony that she's selling up and emigrating to Panama. The two men are quite shocked. It's pretty out of the blue, but they can see that Anne has her heart set on it. She's been over there on holiday already and loved it. She's arranged all of her finances and found a lovely apartment out there that she likes, and so they support her. She's been through a lot and they just want her to be happy. Neither of them still live in the northeast. They both live closer to London, so it's not possible for them to just drop in on her whenever they want. So they think she's probably lonely and just wants a fresh start. And they are totally understanding. They even help her move her finances around just to make life easier for her, and off Anne goes for her new life in Panama. And that brings us up to where we left off in the timeline. It's December 2007 and John Darwin has just walked into the West End Central London police station and said, "I think I'm a missing person." Hartlepool police have called Mark and Anthony, who are 31 and 29 by this point, and are, after almost 6 years of presuming their father is dead, suddenly hearing that he's alive and asking to see them. And so, of course, they rush straight over there to where John is being kept. They live near London, so they can. The brothers don't believe at first that it's really him until they walk in and see their dad almost 6 years from the day he went missing, presumed dead, and he's standing right in front of them. It's a miracle. It's incredibly emotional for them. All Mark and Anthony can do is sit and stare at their dad, not able to believe that it's him. He's right there, something they'd always wished for but never truly believed could happen. So of course the boys immediately call their mother Anne, who is shocked but of course over the moon. And the boys take John home for his first evening back with his family. That same evening, a journalist named Simon Walton is making his usual late-night phone calls to the local police stations to find out if anything newsworthy has happened that day. And it's then that they tell him about John Darwin returning from the dead. And of course, this is music to a journalist's ears. A local man who Simon actually remembers going missing almost 6 years ago has come back from the dead with no memory of where he's been. Of course, he runs with this story the next day. Now, this is not just great local news, this makes for great national news. So before Mark and Anthony know it, there's reporters at their front door, and this is big news. Now, the police have already released John. It's not a pressing issue for them. They've got bigger things to deal with, but the press are fascinated from day one and are hungry for more information. Everyone wants an interview with the family, and even more so, they want the first interview from Anne. So lots of journalists head over to Panama, hoping to be the one to get the first scoop with this missing man's wife. And on the 3rd of December, journalist David Lee is the first to turn up to interview Anne. After some persuasion, Anne agrees to speak with him, and David is over the moon. He's going to get the first interview with the wife of the man who's just come back from the dead. So Anne gives the interview. She says how crazy the timing is, as she's only just moved to Panama to start her new life 6 weeks ago. She says she can't wait to see him and it's a miracle. Anne had cashed in John's life insurance once John had been declared dead, so David asks about this and does that mean she'll have to pay it back now? But Anne says she just wants to get back to the UK to see her husband, and if she has to pay that money back, she'll cross that bridge when she comes to it. So the interview ends and Anne and David spend the day together because Anne is being harassed by journalists by this point, so David just helps to keep her away from them. They have dinner together later in the day and Anne seems a little down, and David says, "You don't look happy. You should be the happiest woman in the world right now." And Anne says she is, it's just a lot to take in. David then receives an email and excuses himself from the table. He returns shortly after and says, "Anne, I have something to show you. It's a picture, and I'm afraid it's not going to be very easy for you to look at." And David shows Anne a photograph taken less than 2 years ago. It's a photograph of Anne in Panama on holiday with her husband, John Darwin. David says to Anne, "The game's up. We know you've been lying." When presented with the photograph, Anne holds her head in her hands and cries. She doesn't speak for 10 minutes until she eventually says, "Well, I guess that picture says an awful lot, doesn't it?" David had received that photograph from a member of the public who just happened to do a very brief Google search of the words John, Anne and Panama, and that photograph popped up by pure chance. And just like that, one of the most famous cons in UK history was exposed when the very next day that photo was featured as a world exclusive in the Mirror newspaper, running with the headline, "Canoe's this in Panama?" Do you know, the press still have a field day with that canoe pun? It's literally put into every article about John Darwin to this day. And that aspect of this case, I think, is quite funny, to be fair. Now, this member of the public does also send the photo to the police, who go into a little bit of a panic, knowing that this photo is going to be in the papers the very next day. So they have to get to John in case he sees it first and does a runner. I can imagine there were a few beads of sweat on those officers, hot-footing it over to where John is staying, hoping that he's not had a tip-off and scarpered. The police have managed to get a fast-tracked arrest warrant, and so they're pulling no punches when they arrive at Anthony's house, pushing him aside as soon as he opens the door and immediately arresting John on suspicion of fraud. So at this stage, we know 3 things. We know that John is a liar. We know that he's been alive the whole time, and his wife Anne has been in on it the entire time. But how on earth did this whole thing come about? Well, let me tell you the full story, and strap in because it's crazy. One of my favourite sayings is that truth is always stranger than fiction, and this case sums that up perfectly. Now, let's go back in time to when John and Anne were first married and when the 2 boys were small. Now, I mentioned that John was ambitious to leave his working class roots, but I didn't really mention how much. He was obsessed with it. Anne and John's marriage wasn't a very happy one for very long, and once the 2 boys were born, John quickly became bored with his lot in life, having no less than 2 affairs within the first few years of marriage. The second affair was discovered when Anne caught him red-handed, and whilst John promised to end it, he didn't, until his mistress's husband turned up at his door demanding that he stay away from his wife. But it wasn't only John's marriage that didn't satisfy his needs. He also wanted a larger income, and as I mentioned earlier, money was a huge priority for him. He had several job moves in quick succession, and as we know, he ended up as a prison guard. But that salary wasn't enough. John wanted to retire by 50 and frequently bragged that he was a financial whiz and he would one day be a millionaire. So he looked towards the property market, hoping to build a property empire of his own. John's plan was to buy houses with plenty of bedrooms so that he could then rent them all out individually to young people on housing benefits. He saw this as a guaranteed income because those benefits would go directly to him via the local authority. And so with this in mind, he bought a house in a place called Chester Street with 5 bedrooms in. And then after that, he bought another 11 houses, all in deprived areas, because he knew that the cost of the houses themselves were very low and the standards required of landlords in those areas were also pretty basic. Whilst John expected the money to just come pouring in from all of these properties, they didn't. A lot of the tenants in these deprived areas couldn't or wouldn't complete the application forms for housing benefit, and so they would be moved on when they inevitably couldn't pay. These houses were never full long enough to get any rental income from them, so John was paying the mortgages and the initial outlay to carry out basic renovations and then receiving very little profit back. And even though this was happening, he then went and bought more, believing that it would all work out in the end, which seems to be very much John's motto in life. No matter how bad things are, he buries his head in the sand and maintains his signature arrogance that things are going to be fine in the end, because he's very intelligent and a financial whiz and is going to be a millionaire any day now. You might be wondering what Anne thought of all this. Well, John's ideas always seemed terrible to her and destined to fail. Anne would see his failures coming a mile off, but she knew it was never worth the battle with John to try to talk him out of it. He was so arrogant and even aggressive when challenged. The problem with John was that although he was supremely confident in his abilities, his actual abilities didn't match up. He wasn't financially savvy enough to keep all of these plates spinning, and he was swiftly nosediving into financial difficulties and taking his entire family along for the ride. And then he made another questionable financial decision, which really signalled the beginning of the swift financial downward spiral the family would soon find themselves in. As we know, the family move in December 2000 to number 3 and 4 The Cliff in Seaton Carew. John takes all of the mortgages he has on all of the properties he owns and puts them into what's called a global mortgage. So, as you can imagine, collectively this amounted to an enormous mortgage debt with huge monthly payments. And as I said, he isn't earning much from the rental properties, and the two he's just bought to live in are also incredibly run down and need a lot of work. The two houses, 3 and 4 The Cliff, have a door which connects the two houses from inside, and inside there are over 13 rooms spread across 4 floors. So the family are living in one part of the house and then they're surrounded by living tenants. But because both houses are both run down and old and pretty beaten up, John can't attract the tenants that he hopes for. These rooms mostly attract single unemployed men, which is a bit unnerving for Anne with her 2 children in the house. And again, just like the other properties, these houses are not the gold mines John expects them to be. He's working shifts at the prison and then coming home and spending every hour he has doing bits of work to these houses just to make them look more presentable. So John has an enormous global mortgage. He's bought a Range Rover just to show off with, to pretend he's made it big, and he also owes £64,000 across 13 different credit cards and high interest loans. It gets to the point where the banks are not willing to loan John another penny, and he hates them for it. And all the way through this case, John blames that specific bank for absolutely everything that happens to him. The couple really are in a nightmare situation. John hates his job, their marriage is rocky, and most concerningly, they're heading straight for financial ruin, and filing for bankruptcy is looking to be their only option. But John just isn't the type to allow that to happen. Even though Anne tells him they should just cut their losses and file for bankruptcy, he won't have it. John is a show-off. He wants to always appear to be the financial genius with an investment empire. He sees bankruptcy as the ultimate failure. To him, it's shameful, and he cannot let that happen. John tries to get an advance lump sum on his pension, but he isn't able to do that. He even considers crashing his Range Rover to claim on the insurance, as he isn't able to return it, but he decides against that in case he actually does kill himself in the process. And it's at this point that John Darwin announces to his wife Anne that he's going to fake his own death in order to avoid bankruptcy, and he will do so by disappearing into the North Sea in his canoe. So we already know that John took himself out in his canoe that day, but it wasn't for pleasure, it was a planned outing with the absolute intent of faking his own death. When I say planned, I think he only put this plan together in the space of a few weeks at the absolute most. The neighbours do see him out on the water that day, but they only watch him until John is out of sight, which is exactly what John intended. And once he is out of sight, John heads straight back to shore, emerging from the water at the first pier south of Seaton Carew. He gets changed into some dry clothes from the backpack he'd taken with him, and he telephones Anne to collect him. Anne cannot believe he's gone through with it, but even so, she goes and collects her husband from where he's been hiding amongst the sand dunes, and she takes him to Durham train station. Whilst in the car, John seems almost elated, laughing about how his plan has gone seamlessly, with witnesses being just in the right place at the right time. Anne says her goodbyes to John, drops him off at the station, goes straight home and, as requested by John, reports him missing. And we know what happens next. A £100,000 sea and air search takes place, and scores of brave volunteers spend days searching for a man who was in the water for probably less than 2 hours. Anne later said that she had no idea the search would be that huge, but of course it would be. These volunteers value life and they're willing to put themselves at risk to try to preserve it. So as we know, the police interview Anne many times and she lies through her teeth, telling them what John instructed her to tell them and acting the grieving wife. She watches as her two sons are distraught, confused and upset, hoping desperately that their much-loved father is found alive. A few days pass and Anne finally hears from John, who has spent some time in a bed and breakfast under a false name and sometimes sleeping in a tent on the beach. He's calling from a payphone asking how it's all going, and Anne says it's a living nightmare. She's been left to do all the lying whilst he gets to just hide away playing dead. 3 weeks pass and the next phase of John's plan is set to go ahead, and this is, I think, when you really get an idea of just how arrogant and self-confident this man really is. John needs somewhere to live, but he has no money, so he goes to the one place that's free of charge. He goes home, to number 3 The Cliff, Seaton Carew. Anne again tries to get John to give this crazy idea up, saying they're putting their son through hell, but John refuses. She even suggests telling them about the plan, but John says no. If they tell the boys and they agree to keep this secret, which he doesn't think they will anyway because they're good, honest men, then technically they'll be complicit in this crime, and so Anne agrees they shouldn't know. So John stays with Anne in the family part of the house, and because there's conjoining doors between number 3 and number 4, John sets up what he refers to as his little foxhole in the basement of number 4. So if anyone ever turns up unexpectedly, he can run from number 3 to number 4 through the conjoining door and straight down to the basement, to his little foxhole. On numerous occasions, John comes very close to being found by the police, who are at this point still making random searches of the house, but John always manages to hide before being discovered. So a little time passes and the police scale down their search, and John settles into this new normal and gets to work on the next phase of his life, or death. John doesn't intend on staying hidden forever, so he needs a new identity in order to get a passport. Getting the idea from his favourite book, The Jackal, he goes looking for a record of a child who died in infancy. In the book, the character goes looking through a cemetery in order to do that, but John just scans the local archives. And amazingly, he manages to find one, a John Jones born the same year as John Darwin, but who had died only a few weeks later from enteritis. John took the reference number of this name and then applied for a copy of this poor child's birth certificate. He then joined the local library dressed in a disguise, had the librarian vouch for him on his passport application, and applied for a passport using that birth certificate. And it worked. Just like that, John had a new identity. He was now John Jones, born March 27th, 1950, and he had the passport to prove it. As it happens, much later when all this came out, the real John Jones family heard about what John did, and it was very upsetting for them. This case has always amused people on the whole because it's so mad, but it was by no means victimless, and baby John's family were just one of the numerous victims in this. Their innocent relative's identity had been stolen, and that baby had not been given a second thought. It was done in order to commit fraud, and that was very upsetting for them. So John has his passport, but he is becoming restless and bored, stuck in that little room, so he starts to venture outside. John, in his typical absolute unwavering self-confidence, would frequently leave his house and go for a walk along the beach where he faked his own death just a few months before. By this point, John has grown a very long beard and wears a hat, so his face is mostly covered. He also puts on a limp and uses a walking stick and just walks around his hometown of Seaton Carew, totally confident he's too clever to be caught. Next, John's attention turns to Anne and having her start proceedings to cash in on his pensions and life insurance. He writes the letters for Anne and she clears up all of the spelling mistakes and grammatical errors that the former teacher of 18 years makes, and she signs them and sends them off. But of course, they can't really follow through on these claims until John is officially declared dead. You may remember I told you a body washed up on the shore close to where John went missing and that Anne had to confirm that it wasn't him. Well, that takes on a much different angle when you realise that Anne knew fine well that that body wasn't going to be John, but she had to go through the motions of confirming it anyway, the whole time knowing that her husband was at home, very much alive. So the inquest comes around, and as we know, in April 2003, John is declared missing, presumed dead. And John is over the moon. He believes he is a genius to have pulled this off. He already thinks he's highly intelligent anyway, so to him this is just proof. He's elated, not giving a second thought to those two boys who lost their dad. They were grieving the death of their father, whilst he is jumping up and down in his little hidey hole, calling himself a genius. And as for Anne, she's just relieved that it's done and it's official. So Anne and John now have this much coveted death certificate, and they get to work claiming that money. Anne receives a mortgage protection payout, 2 pension payouts from John's 2 previous jobs, and a life insurance payout, all amounting to approximately £249,000. And she uses that money to pay off a huge chunk of their debts, and when that's done she starts selling off their properties, meaning more money coming in, all under the watchful eye of John. In 2004, Anthony gets married, and of course John doesn't attend. The whole ceremony is tinged with that sadness of knowing someone is missing. Except he wasn't missing, he was at home. The boys even held a memorial on the anniversary of John's death, and it's so clear these boys adored their dad. So John is back to being very bored, cooped up in that room, so he spends hours playing a 3D multiplayer role-playing video game on the internet called EverQuest. This game is the type where there's a community and you can chat to others. You take on identities within this fantasy world and you roleplay and make friends if you wish. John is a druid in this game, and at some point he heroically comes to the rescue of a fellow player, an American named Kelly Steele. So after John very bravely rescues Kelly within this fantasy game, the two get chatting. John tells Kelly that he is a widowed man, looking to move to America to buy land and settle down with a pretty girl whilst there. Clearly forgetting he's married, but that's nothing new for John. Kelly lives in Kansas City in the US. She's a divorced mother of 2 in her 40s. John chats to Kelly pretty much every day via this online game, and they get to know each other fairly well. With money always being at the forefront of John's mind, he gets to chatting with Kelly about how he'd like to invest in properties, and Kelly mentioned that in Kansas City there are some rundown cattle ranches that are available for people to buy at a reduced rate and then renovate to make a profit. John tells Kelly he wants to renovate a ranch, and Kelly tells John she's happy to do the research for potential properties, and if he goes ahead and buys one, she'll take that property and renovate it, with a view to them both taking some profit. And that sounds good to John. So John wires the money over, the property is purchased, and the plan goes ahead, with Kelly renovating it and John being the silent partner. However, in June 2004, everything comes very close to crashing down around Anne and John. Police receive a report that John has been sighted outside of his own home. A former colleague of John spots him, and he is 100% sure that it's John, so he calls the authorities. However, instead of going straight over there to check it out, the police call Anne and tell her about this sighting. And that's it. No follow-up visits, nothing. If they'd have turned up after that sighting without calling Anne first, they'd have likely caught John. But instead, all the police do is give Anne and John the heads up. So this sighting puts the frighteners on John, and he decides he needs to make himself scarce for a while, which is when he decides to go over to the US to see the ranch he's bought. Anne isn't happy at all about him going, given his track record around other women, but she's actually glad of the break from him, so he flies over to Kansas City to meet Kelly and to see his newly purchased property. Now, precisely what happened between John and Kelly before he went over to meet her depends on whose side you hear, because Anne's under the impression that the two sent very explicit emails to each other, but Kelly herself says that they were just business partners and that's it. John sent over almost $30,000, but when he gets over there and sees what Kelly's bought, he's furious. He says he's been conned, which is ironic given who we're talking about here. Kelly can't stand John on arrival. She says he's creepy and inappropriate with her, and eventually she asks him to leave. So John goes home, back to Anne, tail between his legs, and $30,000 lighter, with nothing much to show for it. It's looking like genius John might have been swindled. So John starts emailing Kelly in a bid to scare her into giving him his money back. John threatens Kelly and her family. He says he knows a gangster from New York named Giovanni who will do a job on her if necessary, which is all absolute rubbish, of course. He doesn't know anyone, he's just trying to scare her. But Kelly doesn't know that, and she's terrified. Kelly goes straight to the police about John's threatening emails, which in fairness seems a strange thing to do if you have conned someone out of $30,000. The police take this seriously and they forward it on to the FBI, which really scares John, so he backs off immediately and accepts that he's just probably never going to see that money again. So back home, John concocts another genius idea. He wants to be a man of the sea. He contacts a man named Robert Hopkin, who is a boat salesman. John tells Robert he wants to buy a catamaran for him to live in with his partner. He wants to become self-sufficient on this boat and spend a lot of time on it. Bearing in mind John has absolutely no sailing experience. And John finds the perfect boat, a catamaran named the Boonara. But after haggling so aggressively with Robert and his company, they end up ceasing communication with him. Because John is so aggressive and demanding, they actually turn down a potential sale worth around £30,000, just so they don't have to do business with this man. So that's another idea John has to abandon. By now it's 2006 and John has been dead for 4 years, and he's still fixated on looking for places to move to be able to live freely as a living dead man without having to look over his shoulder all the time. And he happens upon Panama. John loves the look of Panama. It seems exactly like the kind of place someone like him can disappear in. And of course, once he's made his mind up, that's it. So he tells Anne they're moving to Panama. Go over there for a holiday first to check the place out, and whilst there they visit a very friendly estate agent named Mario, and they become friends during the time that they're there. And on the 14th of July 2006, Mario asks John and Anne for a quick photo as a memento of meeting his new British friends, and before they can say no, Mario's wife takes a photo of John, Anne and Mario. Little did they know that photo would one day feature on the front page of newspapers across the globe. So Anne and John are really excited about Panama. They love it. They feel relaxed there, and even Anne, for the first time in a long time, feels content out there. So it's full steam ahead for them, and they look for somewhere they can buy. They view a 481-acre plot of mostly scrubland and jungle in a place called Escobal, which has no running water and no electricity. As you can imagine, building on this land would be a mammoth task for anyone, but John, being the financial whiz and property expert that he is, immediately falls in love with the place and is sure that it will, say it with me, all work out in the end. They visit the estate agent's office and pay $390,000 for the land, planning to make this somewhere that paying guests can visit and stay in a luxurious eco-lodge, and to perhaps even receive canoeing lessons from John. So in order to move to Panama, they need to sell their 2 conjoined houses in Seaton Carew. But they know they'll never sell the houses conjoined, so they have them completely separated and ready for sale. On John's instructions, Anne gives their son Mark £30,000 in premium bonds, and he then buys the houses for that £30,000 from Anne with those bonds. And then once the houses are sold for the full asking price, he gives that £30,000 back to Anne as cash. Now, I'm not great at understanding this kind of thing, but what I think happened here is Anne gave Mark premium bonds, which were stolen because they came from John's insurance. Mark then bought the houses from Anne with these bonds, and after selling the houses to members of the public, that profit came back as cash. And that's money laundering, putting stolen money into the system and then getting it back out the other side as legitimate cash. So whilst Mark just thought he was helping his mother out, what he'd actually done was illegally laundered a portion of his parents' stolen pension and insurance claims. John and Anne knew that if John was ever caught, that this would make it much more difficult to prove that Mark had no idea his dad was still alive. But John didn't really care. In his mind, it was just another genius money-making move on his part. So John flies to Panama a week before Anne, who stays to make sure the sale of the houses go through okay. And as we know, Anne tells her sons that she's emigrating, which they find odd but accept, assuming that she needs a fresh start. But we now know that she's going over there to make a fresh start, all right, with her dead husband. So after they sell their Seaton Carew homes, Anne flies out there to join John, and they use the house proceeds to acquire a fully furnished flat in Panama City, whilst their project in Escobal is underway, and they squirrel the rest of their money away from the UK and into bank accounts in Panama. The Panama banking system is, shall we say, more discreet than UK ones. And that's it. They're ready to start their new life in Panama, except we know that they don't. We know that 6 weeks later, John turns up in a London police station. They seem to be set up for life now, so why 6 weeks later does John leave? Well, the Panamanian government are in the process of making changes to their visa laws, specifically their permanent residency visas. The new laws state that if you require a residency visa in Panama, you are required to get, in writing, a good character reference from your local police constabulary. And for Anne and John, that will be Cleveland Police, the same constabulary that are under the impression that John's dead. Panama are also cracking down on short stay visas, so if any foreigners are found continually renewing their tourist visa, then they'll be refused it and sent home. And both Anne and John are currently on short stay tourist visas, so they're in trouble. And this is where John's famously bizarre decision-making skills come in once again, because this information wasn't even new to John. John knew about these rules 4 months before he told Anne. He knew before they bought land in Panama. He knew this and he still went ahead with the whole thing, assuming that yet again it'd all work out in the end. Typical John behaviour, living in a complete fantasy world, making terrible decisions with no way of getting out of them. Anne didn't know any of this, so she's in full panic mode and at a complete loss as to what to do about it. And it's at this point that John lands his next surprise on Anne. He's going to come back to life. John is going back to the UK to let the police know, hey, I'm alive, so that he can get his identity back and return to Panama. He genuinely believes the police are going to be like, oh, hi John, glad you're not dead. Here's your character reference, you go enjoy Panama, and don't forget to send a postcard. So as opposed to what the papers said at the time, John didn't return because he had an argument with Anne. He also didn't return because he missed his sons. He literally had to return because he couldn't stay in Panama. So his whole reason for returning to the UK is still classic John. He wants something, and how that impacts his family doesn't matter. John wants his Panama visa. He thinks the police are idiots because he's not been caught yet, and he also thinks he is a genius. So he's going home, he's claiming amnesia, and it's all going to work out in the end. It's quite clear to me that if it wasn't for the visa issue, it's more than likely John would have lived his days out in Panama, and his sons would never have discovered the truth about him. And here we pick up where we left off. The photo of John and Anne in Panama has emerged, and John has been arrested. The police ask Anne to return to the UK immediately, and she returns willingly, and she is met on the plane by armed police who barge onto the aircraft, arrest her and take her away. At the station, Anne foolishly tries to keep up the lie that she didn't know about John, but after being held in a high security women's prison for a while, decides to come clean and confesses. Meanwhile, John is also at the station and is being questioned. He says that his reason for faking his own death was because he was in dire financial trouble. He says he wasn't thinking straight and he was under a lot of stress. In his interviews, John is cocky and rude. Given that he showed up in London on his return from the dead and that he'd clearly needed somewhere to stay for almost 6 years, the police genuinely think it's likely that his sons were involved and that they'd been hiding him in their houses. And so the police ask John, were you living in your son's houses in London during the time you were missing? To which he replies, no, I haven't. The Queen lives in London too, but I haven't been staying in Buckingham Palace. They show John the photo from Panama and they ask who is in the photo, and he says, the ugly one's me, that little fat fella on the left. He just can't help himself to try to be funny or make jokes and be cocky. I think that John knows at this point that his wife hates him, his sons don't want to know him, and he's really at rock bottom, so he's just amusing himself with his own remarks because he's banged to rights. He's lost everything and he's going to prison. He then goes on to say that he intended to pay back all of the money and that's why he'd come back to the UK. He says, why did I come back if I wasn't going to pay back the money? Yes, I claimed amnesia, but that doesn't detract from the fact that I was going to pay back the money. But at the end of the day, as far as the police are concerned, John had invested money in Kansas, he'd opened a Panama bank account, he'd almost bought a boat, he'd bought land in Panama and a fully furnished apartment. If he wanted to pay the money back, he wouldn't have spent so much of it, would he? During this time, a very shocked and distressed Mark and Anthony issue a statement publicly condemning their parents, saying that they would never speak to their parents again, and who could blame them? They'd been totally betrayed by their own parents, and they even unknowingly engaged in money laundering. Imagine if the police hadn't believed them and they'd both gone to prison for money laundering too. All of this was very public and very humiliating and painful for them, and they agreed to give evidence for the prosecution at the trial against Anne and John. So the pair go to trial, and Anne pleads not guilty to 9 charges of deception and 9 charges of money laundering on the grounds of marital coercion. In other words, she's saying John forced her to do all of this. John pleads guilty to obtaining cash by deception and passport offences. He knows the game's up. At the trial, Mark tells the jury what they did crushed his world. The focus of the trial is very much on the theft and the amount of lies both of them told for years. But not only that, the judge focuses on their 2 sons, who he says are the real victims in all of this and were crushed by their parents' deception. And all of that merits a harsh sentence. And on Wednesday, July 23rd, 2008, the verdicts are in. John was found guilty and sentenced to 6 years and 3 months. Anne was also found guilty. They didn't buy her marital coercion excuse, and she was sentenced to 6 years and 6 months. So Anne actually got a longer sentence than John, because John pleaded guilty and Anne pleaded not guilty and tried to blame John. After sentencing, Anne was told that if the courts couldn't get her assets back and use those to pay back the stolen cash, she could still get another 10 years added on top of her sentence. John wouldn't though, because none of those purchases were made in his name. As it happens, they did manage to recoup those assets, and so her sentence was not extended. Their 2 sons wrote to the authorities to try to get their parents lesser sentences. Even after everything they did to them, they still tried to help them. It didn't work, however, and they both did serve their full terms. Anne fell into a huge depression in prison, but used her time to gain qualifications, and even ended up being used as a support to new arrivals at the prison. The officers would often send Anne in when a new inmate was frightened about being in prison and needed an ally. There was even a running joke that Anne was the unofficial chaplain there, giving emotional support to those who needed it. Anne sent her sons many letters with no response, but Mark did in the end warm up to Anne, sending her a letter whilst in prison and then eventually visiting her. And Anthony, after a little more time, also made contact with his mother, and little by little both sons rekindled some sort of relationship with their mother. John, however, got punched in the face in jail and ended up having to move because, if you remember, before all of this happened, he was a former prison officer, and inmates don't like prison officers. Whilst in prison, John writes letters constantly to Anne and calls her on the phone saying they must stay together once they're released. They still have a strong marriage, they cannot separate. Anne's a bit dubious, but she's listening, at which point John then asks if he's okay to have a female pen pal, because a woman has written to him in prison and he's written back and he'd like to continue. I don't know why I'm always surprised by this guy, but I am. In one breath he's begging Anne to stay with him whilst writing letters to other women. He just can't help himself. Then it gets worse. A newspaper article comes out which shows letters from John that he sent to these pen pals on the outside, and it's just lots of John being very inappropriate. Apparently the contents of these letters are really explicit and humiliating for his family to have splashed across the newspapers. Anne knows every inmate in her prison will see this. She's horrified and disgusted by what he's been writing to these women. Needless to say, that put the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. On Wednesday, 9th of March 2011, Anne was released and now lives in York and works for the RSPCA. Her relationship with her sons continues to grow stronger, and she is now a grandmother several times over and is very lucky to have regular contact with her sons and grandchildren too. On the 17th of January 2011, John was released from prison and moved straight back to Seaton Carew, which of course got him back in the papers, which John clearly enjoys. He's always loved the attention he gets for being the Canoe Man. At the height of John's fame, someone even put up a road sign at Seaton Carew train station saying, "Welcome to Seaton Canoe, twinned with Panama." It was removed shortly after. John and Anne were officially divorced not long after release, with Anne getting a restraining order against John after he sent a threatening letter letting her know that even if she divorced him, she would always be his property. John appeared in the papers again in 2013 after he'd travelled to the Ukraine to meet a 25-year-old lady he'd met on a dating website. This young lady was very disappointed when John, the self-proclaimed old ugly fella, turned up and was not quite the established and successful businessman he'd convinced her he was. Once she realised this, she sent him back to where he came from and alerted the press, which of course led to an immediate arrest by police because John wasn't yet allowed to travel internationally. After all of this, he was still breaking the law. Then in 2016 he moved, legally this time, to the Philippines after meeting another woman online, a lady 23 years younger than him named Mercy, and he apparently works on a market stall in the Philippines selling underwear. The book I used for most of this research is one written by Anne herself and the journalist who confronted her with that Panama photo. The book is fascinating. She has a very brief anecdote in there about Rose West, which gave me goosebumps. She even mentions Tracy Andrews in it, which I was really surprised by because Tracy Andrews was the subject of my last video. I'll link a card somewhere up here so you can watch that video if you're interested. I'll also link it in the description below, and I'll link the book in the description below if you're interested in it. And in case you're wondering, Anne does donate all proceeds from the book to the RNLI, which, after costing them £100,000 on a bogus search, seems the least she could do, and some proceeds also go to the RSPCA. The reason being is that Anne is not legally allowed to make any money related to her crimes. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I think it's my favourite case that I've covered so far. It's just nuts. Your jaw just drops further throughout the case. It's absolutely unbelievable, and I can't believe he thought he was going to get away with it, and just how brazen he was. If you did like this video, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. I've got a lot more videos planned. I'd love for you to stick around to see them. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.